UCB Life Issues with Paul Hammond.
And as always, a very warm welcome to this week's Life Issues podcast. Now, what makes a successful church? Let's be honest, for most of us, numbers would be an aspiration, wouldn't they? The big church across town that has enough people to do the work and enough money to pay the bills, well, it can be quite attractive, can't it? Especially if you're looking for somewhere that can offer multiple departments and ministries and perhaps even a degree of anonymity on a Sunday morning when you just want to sit at the back and have nobody notice you. But does the good church have to be mega, multi-campus, multi-service? Could it be that there is a value in the small, that an essential experience of relationship and belonging and nurturing that might get lost in the crowd can be stronger in a group of, 12 maybe? And the way we do church, does it always have to be about sitting in rows and singing songs and hearing a preach? What if there was a different expression that fits a community better? Well, this week, that's our topic. Because in the light of the fact that most churches are not a Hillsong or an Audacious or a Holy Trinity Brompton, but are actually small, is it time to celebrate the small, the different, the church that most of us actually know? Jonathan Bond is Director for Smaller Churches for the FIEC. Mark Robinson is from Fresh Expressions, and we'll hear from him later about how church can be different. But first, Jonathan, what is it that you really love about small churches?
I suppose for me, I was born and brought up in a smaller church. It was part of a circuit of smaller churches. They were all led by lay people who, just by implication, had full-time jobs, part-time jobs, and yet gave hours and hours to the local church to help the nurturing of believers, of those of us that were teens at the time, finding out what it meant to be a Christian, and then as a young Christian, but also, of course, looking for opportunities to evangelize local communities. And I think it really struck a chord with me, the real impact of the gospel in those people's lives. It dominated their lives, their work life, the sacrifice of their free time. And I had a real heart and a huge amount to be grateful for to those individuals. I attended a larger church for 20 years when I moved to Leeds, but then I pastored a smaller church for 18 years. And most of my immediate, I suppose, fellow pastors in the area were pastors of smaller churches. So that's my experience. That's where my heart comes from.
And there is a danger, I suppose, isn't there, in the way in which obviously it's great that there are some really big churches and they have a place and they have a lot of positives to offer. But there is a danger, isn't there, that those who lead and perhaps those who are part of small churches do kind of feel a bit second-class citizens, do feel as though perhaps if we haven't got the numbers of a Holy Trinity Brompton or an Audacious or a Hillsong, that somehow we're falling short, that we're not really being successful. But it's not true, is it?
No, it's not true, certainly. This isn't about an us and them, big churches versus smaller churches in any way. It's not a rivalry. We're both seeking to reach Britain for Christ. I think that in the world today, we measure success by numbers. I've got a business background, and that's the way you measure success, shareholder return, things like that. And there's a danger that that's crept into the church. We measure success by numbers, the number of baptisms, the number of new conversions, the number of people who are in membership. And I think that's wrong. I think we need to find ways of measuring gospel success or the health of a church spiritually without using numbers.
So what do you think we should be? I mean, it's an important part of the equation, I suppose, but what else should we be looking at? What are the sort of things that you're driving at that you think are perhaps the positives that smaller churches can do just as well, if not better, than a larger congregation?
Well, I think in many ways, spiritual health across a large church and a small church looks exactly the same at many levels. I think perhaps there's a different emphasis in certain areas. I think organisationally it's more important in a larger church than a smaller church, maybe because there's a large staff team or there's 1,000 people have got to be catered for each Sunday with directions and things like that. That isn't the case in a smaller church. But I think in a smaller church, those things that stand out, the relational side of it, larger churches should be good at that, but smaller churches have almost, if I could say, no excuse not to be. The welcome they give, it should be impossible to go to a smaller church and people not come up and talk to you because you stand out. There's only a dozen or 20 or 30 there, which of course in a larger church is different. I think the way that you can relate to your community, not all, some smaller churches are in large cities, but a lot of them are in more rural areas, smaller towns. The people are from that location. They tend not to drive into it, which often happens with larger churches. You know your community. You can relate to your community. You're part of the community. And that's something that should enable you to be of greater benefit to that community and know what makes that community tick when it comes to looking for and seizing those gospel opportunities. Of course, as well, there's that loving relationship amongst the members. You know each other in a closer, more intimate way than can ever happen in a church of 300-400. And the leader or the pastor, he knows your name.
Yeah. I was going to make that point to you because there isn't, you use the word community quite a lot there, and you're absolutely right. And I suppose there is a sense in which in a smaller church, in a smaller community, everybody does know everybody. Everybody knows what's going on with everybody. Theoretically, everybody can encourage everybody, but are there negatives to that as well? Can that be a curse as well as a blessing?
I suppose you see people warts and all, so it's possibly easier for the gospel witness of a local church to be damaged by the behaviour of individuals who are widely known within the community. But I don't think that's necessarily a reason not to be enthusiastic about the smaller church in the local community.
I suppose there's a need for a smaller church to actually vector that in, isn't there? Because it can be the case that if you know everybody, that can be that can become quite a critical environment, can't it? Where if people are gossiping or sniping at each other. But if you can actually create an environment where people, because they're a smaller community, because they're a smaller church, feel more bonded, feel more connected, feel more supported by those around them, then that can be an incredibly positive and wholesome thing in a society where people feel increasingly isolated and unknown and unseen and unheard.
I think it can be. One of the things I very much encourage smaller churches when I go and visit them and I talk to them is to ask them what part do they play in their local community. When their local community looks at them, do they see a value? What do they add to their local community? And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the local shop, the chip shop, the pub, it adds something to the local community. What does the church do? What do you do? And I don't just mean from that perspective about gospel witness, because most in the community aren't necessarily interested in that. But what gifts do you have in the church that you could bring to the local community to be of benefit? and through that to hopefully create gospel opportunities. But it is so important that there is that oneness within the church. I suppose it was Jesus who said, the way that you love each other is going to be very noticeable. It's something that's very different to society. And of course, that gospel, that oneness in Christ, as you were saying, within society now, that there is a loneliness. And people can come into a local church, and perhaps more so a smaller one, and find something that they're really missing in their life and in the local community.
What are the sort of challenges that are faced as you work with smaller churches? I suppose an obvious one would be people to do the jobs and money to pay for the jobs to be done. But what are the sort of problems or the sort of challenges that are faced in a smaller congregation?
I think as you pick up there, if you've got a congregation of 300 and a congregation of 20, the gifts that the people have are going to be more restricted. And that will have an impact upon the ministry that the church is able to do. I think finance is often an issue. That there are some small wealthy churches because they've been able to sell a manse or inherited money, but as a general principle, covering the cost of a paid employee, a pastor, it's an insurmountable problem to have. So I think that's an issue as well. Often the age profile of the smaller church is higher as well. Often they don't have families, so what happens is a family moves into the area, visits the church 2 or 3 times, and because they're the only family, maybe they're the only family with children, they move to the larger church. That, of course, would apply to couples, younger couples, and single people as well. I think it's these are the sort of obstacles. I think as well today, people aren't necessarily as committed to what can we give to the church, what can we offer to the church, possibly a more consumer, what can the church give me? And that's, of course, where larger churches can offer a lot more than smaller churches. And I think also the fact that, and this may be true perhaps just as much for leaders as well it is for people looking for a church they attend, smaller churches aren't as attractive as larger churches. The team ministry, it's attractive in a larger church. In a smaller church, if you're the sole leader, there's a loneliness.
Yes.
It's insurmountable, that problem. It's a fact, and that's why those small networks of 2-3 people are very important.
But that's an important thing there, though, isn't it? That it is, these challenges aren't insurmountable. Yes, a small church might not be able to afford to pay a full-time minister. But as you said, as your experience, growing up in a church where it was folk from the community that led the church and sacrificially gave of themselves in order to lead the church and obviously lead it successfully because it produced you, it nurtured and encouraged you, didn't it? So these things aren't insurmountable, right down to people perhaps. Is there a case for saying, look, if we want to see a local effective representation of our faith, a local effective serving of the needs of our community, we actually need to be sacrificial. And while it might be easier to take our family down the road to the big church where there's a very active Sunday school and so on, actually we need to recognise a calling to a local, smaller community to serve there and maintain a witness there.
I think that's very much true. I think for people who are maybe slightly more consumer-minded in when they're looking for a church about what can the church give me, they are missing out on so much about how the Lord may choose to use them to be a blessing to a local small church and that church's community. The fact is that families attract families. And if there is a family in the church, it is easier to reach a local community where you're trying to reach other families as well. So I think that sacrificial commitment. And one of the things I found as a pastor is that if a family would stop for 3 to 6 months, another family would come because they'd moved into the area and they were trying you out as a church. There was already a family there as well. So they weren't the new only family. I think there are things like that. But I also want to say as well, when we talk about sacrifices, is one of the things I found is larger churches helping and supporting and partnering with smaller churches, them sacrificing their people to help a smaller gospel church. And that's been very helpful as well.
And that is happening more and more, isn't it? As we're seeing some, especially perhaps in the States more than here yet, but we're seeing some very big churches that are turning around going, right, enough of this being lost in a crowd. We're actually going to make, instead of a church of 1,000 people, we're going to make 10 churches of 100 people. And we are going to spread out into our community and we're going to have more impact. And there is that sort of willingness to sow into smaller churches, to support smaller churches, and to equip. I suppose the danger is people then feel as though you're taking over a bit.
Well, it is. I think it has to be done sensitively. You can plant into an existing small church and effectively take it over. And at times that may be the only way that smaller church is going to survive. It has to be done sensitively. But there's also ways in which you can encourage people with specific gifts to go and start being a part of a smaller church.
Yes.
And often that involves leadership as well. Leadership's so important. And I think where that happens, that's been a great blessing as well. There's been a number of examples I can think of where churches that were once really struggling because a larger church partnered with them and maybe encouraged them with leadership, with specific gifts, that with the people that they sent, that those churches are now reaching out into their communities in ways that they couldn't have done a few years before.
You made the point earlier on that the last thing we want to do is in any way denigrate larger churches. We want to celebrate and we want to honour the impact that they can have. But given that the vast majority of churches in this country are not mega churches, they're not multi-campus, they're not multi-service. The vast majority of churches, they sit sort of between the 50 to 150 mark in terms of regular attenders. Given that is the case, is there a need for us as individuals, but also for our denominations, our church movements, and we come from very different traditions. But the messaging that you're talking about, I've heard all my life in being a part of smaller churches and in leading smaller churches. Is there a case that the denominations need to start to recognise more overtly the value of a small, faithful community serving God and praying for the place where they are?
I don't necessarily think that organisations, whether it's mainstream denominations or whether it's organisations like FIEC with independent churches, have lost sight of the importance of smaller churches. I think there's perhaps a danger that within different organisations, larger churches rise to the top, the profile of the church, the profile of the church leader. And I think the balance does need to be readdressed, certainly within the organisation I'm a part of, FIEC, with the smaller church. I suppose I'm part of the evidence that FIEC has very much recognised that and is very much looking to promote ways in which they can be of help and benefit to smaller churches, whether that's at an organisational level or whether that's with larger churches looking to support and partner with smaller churches, or whether it's just trying to enthuse and encourage smaller church leaders to support each other in little networks of 3, 4, where they can be a help and a blessing to each other.
Jonathan Bond is the Director for Small Churches for the FIEC. Thank you for your perspectives today, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've been talking about small churches and thinking about it within the context, I suppose, the traditional context of church. But what if we rethought church completely? Is sitting in rows, singing songs and being preached at the only way to do church? Is it even the biblical way to do church, especially if it limits accessibility for those who don't know Jesus? Most of us would say it's okay to be creative in how we do church, but so often, even if we try to push the barriers, we fall back into the same patterns. freshexpressions.org.uk is a Church of England initiative that has been offering the opportunity to challenge that thinking for more than a few years. And Mark Robinson is from Fresh Expressions, joins me to talk about this now. And it should be said that a fresh expression of church isn't about throwing the baby out with the bathwater or change for change's sake, is it, Mark?
Not at all. No, it's very much, it works with the established church and outside the established church. It can do either or depending on people's context. And context is probably the key word.
But that idea of change, which we are so often so resistant to. I mean, one of the things that Fresh Expressions had to battle when it first started, when the initiative first started to gain some sort of momentum, was the resistance to the idea of altering how we do church, because it's how we've always done church. But it's not how the early church did church. It is very much a human construct rather than something that was written alongside the Ten Commandments.
Indeed. I mean, you can even argue the different ways that people do church and the different forms of churchmanship just within the Anglican Church are wide and varied, and people will debate about the fact that organ-based music is still king versus worship that's similar to Hillsong, a big Hillsong event. There's all sorts of stuff that people get really hung up about, and this stuff is not the most important stuff. We can honor the traditions of church and all of the beauty that's there, but also acknowledge that for some people, that's not going to work. And for some people in their different cultures and the different contexts, it's just not going to work. They're not going to buy into it. They're not going to meet with God in that way.
So, granted that it's not change for change's sake, if we determine that there is a need for some sort of change, why should we be looking at our way of doing church and asking, is this what God wants to do in our context right now?
I think the proof in the pudding is that everyone can recognize the numbers of church are in decline. And really, we've got to ask ourselves why. For some, it's like older congregations are passing away, but then that also indicates that there aren't necessarily families joining. But also we know that post-COVID, lots of people just left the church. I think some of the numbers are in certain dioceses are looking at about a third, one diocese I know I'd mentioned. And that's a significant number. But when we ask the question, why, it's not always going to be because people have fallen out of faith. It's because people just don't connect. And we're at a point now where the opportunities for doing things a little bit differently and reaching those people who either have stopped going to church, and even more so, those who would never even have considered going to church in the first place, those opportunities are immense. And that's hugely exciting.
It was a bit of a sort of two-edged sword, wasn't it? The whole experience around the pandemic, in that on one hand, it made us go, oh, we can do church differently. But it also allowed people to step back from going to church on a regular basis. The world didn't come to an end for them. And so they're now going, well, does it have to be always a physical building? Does it have to be always that traditional service? Does it have to be, well, is there a more creative way, I suppose, to express my faith?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, we have a creator God, and we are made in his image and likeness. And so therefore we are all creative. Sometimes people feel they're not that creative, but we're all creative in our different ways. And so when we look at church, there's also a barrier of it being this big effort to think about how we do church differently and making something happen. And I would argue that, and sort of a fresh expressions approach isn't to try and think of something new, but merely to respond to what's already happening. It's the idea of Missio Dei. God's mission is always at work, and we have to see where he's at work, what we can respond to. And that can be a creative process. Sometimes it requires us to be courageous in our creativity, but it's just responding to what's going on. And sometimes it doesn't have to take as much effort as we actually think it does. It can be as simple as often baby and parent groups. These things happen. Sometimes you have parents that meet for coffee once a week regularly, and it's just formalizing that and bringing a bit more of Jesus into those moments.
And that idea of listening to what's happening rather than imposing a change that you've had an idea to do something different, that's a key part of the fresh expressions mindset, isn't it? It is to very much say what is right here. Yeah. So everyone, we talk about, like I said at the beginning, the key word being context. Wherever we are, we can do a form of church. It's going back to the cliche, as it were, of where two or three are gathered. That can be church. So whether it is like a toddler group, or whether it's a lunchtime group at the office, or whether it's a Thursday night football club, and in the pub afterwards, and if you're a Christian with your mates, that you bring Jesus into that conversation. It's just taking those steps and starting and seeing where it goes. Not every one of those will become a set initiative and might end up being church. But often these times when we just try and start to take steps, we start to see other opportunities and other relationships. But it's always based on individual relationships, developing community, and then those communities in turn can then develop into church. So do we have to do church on Sunday?
Oh, it depends who you ask. But strictly speaking, I'd say no. If you have a community of people and you start to impose rules or impose a culture, you'll be immediately rejected. The beauty of sort of looking at the context is usually it's a community that you already belong to. So there's a culture, there's a way of doing things. So for example, if it's a Thursday night footy club, you're already doing a service as such. If that turns into something where you're, I don't know, sharing Bible stories and talking about it, that is a form of church. Now, some would argue that you must get people into the pews, as it were, and most churches, as people recognize it, is very much an attractional model. It's about counting bums on seats and filling the pews. But when our focus is filling those pews, it becomes a marketing exercise, and it becomes about the more important thing is filling numbers and filling those pews. Whereas when we come back and just think about relationship and the impact that we have, because you can have a full church, and you can have a very full church, but in that church you might have a lot of people who are not meeting with Jesus and who are not making relationship and are incredibly lonely. Whereas when you have one-to-one relationships and that slow developing of community, that's always genuine, based in relationship, based in love and kindness and all of those basic things that we're taught to do as Christians.
It does seem to me that a lot of the Fresh Expressions model is about it's a missional thing, it's an outreach thing. How do you make sure that a reinvention of church, a fresh expression of church, a remodeling of church that gets away from it always has to be the sitting in pews or in rows and singing the songs on a Sunday? It's more about relation. It's more about community. How do you ensure that nurtures and develops and supports the congregation that are already there? as well as the congregation that you're looking to reach out to?
Well, there's an assumption in that you're doing what you're effectively starting a fresh expression alongside an already established church. And of course that does happen. And yeah, we hear examples of that happening constantly all the time, where people see a gap in their congregation, they start a new initiative, and that becomes what you might call a fresh expression of church. But often a lot of the fresh expressions are often led by lay people who aren't ordained, don't have theological degrees. They just see a gap of how they can love people and bring Jesus into a situation. But for sure, for those people who maybe are already leading a church and they start a new initiative, I think most of the time when people do that, they're responding to what God is presenting them. You know, it's often, we say most fresh expressions are often prophetic in nature because it's a response to the Spirit calling someone into something. And we know that when God calls us into something, he will equip us for it. There are often conversations then politically within churches about, is the vicar being pulled or is the church leader being pulled in too much into one initiative over another? But that's not uncommon for whether you're doing a fresh expression or not.
Churches have been having those conversations virtually since they sat in the upper room. Yes, indeed. So, okay, how do we know then? How do we know that the idea that is being pursued is actually a creative expression that is a positive way rather than simply jumping on a trend or a fad? Because I remember when some churches started looking at a sort of cafe church sort of format, and then suddenly everybody was doing cafe church, usually quite badly, but nonetheless trying to do it. And it was very much about, it was the fashion, it was the flavour of the moment. How do we make sure that what we're doing is actually a creative response to the need of our community rather than just jumping on the bandwagon?
I think the first thing to ask is, if you're looking at someone else doing something and you're wanting to replicate what they're doing, you probably need to stop at that stage, because that's probably the wrong approach. What one church might do works for their context, especially when it's a successful initiative. So what works for them, but it's probably not going to work for you. You might be able to do it for a while, but then often these things, when someone's just purely trying to replicate, it usually falls apart and it doesn't quite work. However, getting inspiration from different initiatives and different creative initiatives, that is definitely the way to go. But it's also, again, when someone sees a gap of where people are either unchurched or are falling away from church or whatever it might be, when someone sees a gap, has a passion for that, at that stage, they can then be inspired by different fresh expressions or different forms of creative church and take little ideas and build their own thing. And that's where the creativity comes in. Is there a guarantee that it will succeed? Absolutely not. But that's part of the journey, isn't it? And we've heard stories over the years where people have run a fresh expression for 3 months and a bunch of people have come to faith, and then it's naturally come to an end. And then there are other fresh expressions of church that have been going on for years and years and years. But part of our methodology is about doing it again. So you start something, you go through the motions of it, and obviously we have a whole plan for how one can approach this. But the key thing is to do it again and start something new, and let the people that you've brought up into it take over, and let them disciple them so that they're doing new things as well. So in some cases, some fresh expressions might only last a short time, and in others, they'll go on for years and years, but it just depends on that context.
There's a whole load of stuff I know on your website that actually gives people sort of insight and guidance about, if you're thinking about this, how to look at it. freshexpressions.org.uk is the website. But I wonder if, as well as the possibility of a fresh expression of church within a community, seeing a gap and stepping into that, is there also a sense in which the principle, the mindset, the thinking behind fresh expressions is something that every church should be taking on board, because we have for thousands of years, it feels like, been in the same fundamental model of church. It is really easy to become stuck in the groove of how we've always done it. Do we need to be more courageous for traditional format of church to actually ask, is there a fresh expression, sort of small f, small e, of what we should be doing, what we can be doing, to make it more about those who are outside as well as those who are inside?
It's about being missional, isn't it? And I think sometimes I always find it interesting when a church, an established church, describes itself as being missional, when by their nature, churches should be missional at the very least. And so there's one thing of serving a community, an established community, and all of the beauty and joy that brings, and furthering people in their discipleship and all of that good stuff. But I think everyone has to acknowledge that because we're individuals, my flavor of one thing might not suit someone else's flavor of one thing. And so wherever you're based in your community, if you are an established church, there's always going to be people on the margins. And sometimes those margins are very far removed from your church doorstep. And the goal shouldn't be to bring them into your doorstep and into your building. The goal should be for you to be going out, doing the mission and going out into your community. Often we do have this thing of established Christian communities being very much siloed and being a nice community. And there's some stuff that they go out for, but almost I've never met any church leader who doesn't wish that they were doing more of going out and meeting people. And I think there's a real thing about being invited into the little micro subcultures and pockets of places that are out there. And when you get invited into that, you're not instilling your culture and your church culture. That culture is inviting you in to bring Jesus in with you. And that's just some of the basics, I think, about mission that sometimes gets missed in the busyness.
Mark Robinson from Fresh Expressions, who along with Jonathan Bond from FIEC, my guests for this week's Life Issues. Now, what are we about with this week's podcast? It's certainly not to denigrate or decry large churches, because when a bonfire of light blazes like a large church in its community, well, it is staggering in its impact and the potential for service and to do things and accomplish things because of the resources is phenomenal. But does that mean that the smaller church is inadequate, is less important? Does that mean that a creative expression of church that is perhaps different to the normal thought of what church should be is somehow accomplishing less for God's kingdom? Interesting thing about Jesus' life was that while he spoke to the crowds, he also went out of his way to speak to the one. And maybe we need to remember, especially those of us who are part of smaller churches or different churches, and we're inclined to feel a little envious or inadequate or failing or constrained to conform. Perhaps we need to remember that whilst the bonfire can blaze bright, the candle also dispels the darkness. You've been listening to UCB Life Issues. I'm Paul Hammond. Thank you to Mark and Jonathan, my guests for this week. Thank you also to Rachel, my producer for this week's podcast. And why not join me next week for another Life Issues? Ta-da!